They called it junk. American naval officers examining the bulky, experimental radar set in early 1941 shook their heads at the contraption's crude appearance. The device weighed over 100 pounds, required constant adjustment, and its cathode ray display flickered with ghost images that seemed more like interference than useful information. Some pilots refused to fly with the extra weight. Ground crews complained about the maintenance requirements. Even trained operators struggled to interpret the green blobs on the phosphorescent screen. The technology looked primitive because it was primitive. Compared to the sleek instruments already installed in aircraft and ships, this radar system appeared cobbled together from laboratory equipment, its wiring exposed, its components barely fitting into the cramped spaces of patrol aircraft. Officers accustomed to polished, production-ready equipment saw only an unfinished experiment that would probably fail under operational policy conditions. But on a cold morning in March 1943, in the black waters west of the Bay of Biscay, something changed forever. A Vickers Wellington bomber from Royal Air Force Coastal Command, flying through darkness at 2,000 feet, detected a surfaced U-boat at 18 miles distance. The German submarine, running on diesel engines to recharge its batteries, had no warning. No alarm sounded. The crew felt safe in the night. The aircraft closed the distance in minutes. By the time the U-boat's watch officer spotted the bomber emerging from the darkness, it was far too late to dive. Depth charges bracketed the submarine with devastating precision. The U-boat broke apart and sank within 4 minutes. 52 men died without understanding what had found them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was not an isolated incident. Across the Atlantic, in the Bay of Biscay, along the convoy routes, U-boats were dying. Submarines that had terrorized Allied shipping for years suddenly found themselves hunted with impossible accuracy. Experienced commanders who had survived dozens of patrols were being caught and killed. The Germans suspected traitors, thought perhaps the Allies had broken their codes, wondered if some new weapon had been deployed. They were partially correct. A new weapon had indeed been deployed, but it was not the kind they imagined. It was the same radar technology that American and British officers had initially dismissed. The junk radar, the experimental system that looked too crude to be effective, was killing U-boats at a rate that would ultimately help decide the outcome of World War II. By the time the war ended in 1945, approximately 340 U-boats would be sunk or directly attributable to aircraft equipped with this radar technology. 340 German submarines, each crewed by 40 to 50 highly trained men, destroyed by a device many had considered barely functional. The casualty rate among U-boat crews reached 75%, making it the most dangerous military assignment of the entire war on any side. The story of how this happened begins not with the radar itself, but with the men who built it under desperate circumstances, the physicists and engineers who transformed a theoretical concept into a weapon that changed naval warfare forever. It begins with 2 researchers in a university laboratory in Birmingham, England, working frantically as German bombers struck their city. It begins with a decision to share the most valuable military secret of the war with allies across the Atlantic. And it begins with U-boat crews who, for the first time in their service, experienced something far worse than depth charges or destroyer attacks. They experienced the terror of being hunted by an enemy who could see them in total darkness, through clouds and fog, from distances they thought impossible. An enemy whose detection system they could not hear, could not detect, and could not escape. To understand why this radar technology mattered so desperately, you must first understand what the Allies faced in the Atlantic during 1942 and early 1943. The German U-boat force, under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz, had brought Britain to the edge of starvation and defeat. This was not hyperbole or propaganda. It was mathematical reality. Britain, an island nation, depended entirely on shipping for survival. Every week, convoys carrying food, fuel, ammunition, aircraft, tanks, and raw materials crossed the Atlantic from North America. If these convoys could not get through, Britain would run out of everything needed to continue the war. Churchill himself stated that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire conflict. He understood the arithmetic. If merchant ships were sunk faster than they could be replaced, Britain would be forced to surrender regardless of military victories elsewhere. The U-boats were winning this arithmetic. In 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. To put this in perspective, that represented approximately 1,200 merchant ships sent to the bottom. Each ship carried not just cargo but crews. Merchant sailors died by the thousands in the cold Atlantic, many within sight of rescue ships that could not stop to pick them up without becoming targets themselves. The submarines operated in wolf packs, groups of 8 to 20 U-boats coordinated by radio to mass against convoys. The tactics were brutally effective. U-boats would shadow a convoy on the surface at night, staying beyond visual range, radioing positions to other submarines in the area. When enough U-boats had gathered, they would attack together, overwhelming the wake. Escorts. A single well-executed wolf pack attack could sink 10 or 12 merchant ships in one night. Dönitz needed to sink 700,000 tons of shipping per month to cripple Britain's war effort. By March 1943, he was exceeding that target. That month, the U-boats sank 108 Allied ships, totaling over 600,000 tons. The battle was reaching its crisis point. If the trend continued for 3 more months, Britain's oil reserves would be exhausted. Food rationing, already severe, would have to be cut to levels that would threaten public health and industrial production. The Wolfpack system worked because U-boats spent most of their time on the surface. This seems counterintuitive to modern readers who think of submarines as underwater vessels. But World War II submarines were actually surface ships that could submerge temporarily. They were faster on the surface, could see farther, could communicate by radio, and could run their diesel engines to recharge batteries. A Type 7C U-boat, the most common German submarine, could make 17 knots on the surface, but only 7 knots submerged. Battery power lasted only a few hours at cruising speed when underwater. Submarines therefore preferred to operate on the surface, diving only when aircraft appeared or when attacking. At night, they were practically invisible to ships and aircraft using optical systems. They could see escort ships silhouetted against the horizon long before they themselves could be spotted. This gave them enormous tactical advantage. The Allies tried everything to counter the U-boat threat. They organized convoys with destroyer escorts. They developed better depth charges. They created escort carrier groups. They used high-frequency direction-finding equipment to locate U-boats by their radio transmissions. All of these measures helped, but none proved decisive. The U-boats adapted to each countermeasure. Losses to Allied shipping remained catastrophically high through early 1943. The Allies did have radar by 1942. Radar had been invented independently by British and American engineers in the mid-1930s and had already proven valuable in air defence and naval gunnery. The British chain-home radar system had given crucial early warning during the Battle of Britain. American ships used radar to detect aircraft and surface vessels. The technology itself was not new, but early radar systems operated at relatively long wavelengths, in the metric range. The British ASV Mark II radar, the primary airborne anti-submarine radar in use during 1941 and early 1942, operated at 1.5 meters wavelength, or about 200 megahertz frequency. This radar could detect a surfaced U-boat at about 10 miles range under ideal conditions. In practice, range was often much less due to sea clutter, weather, and the small radar cross-section of a submarine's conning tower. More critically, the Germans developed a countermeasure. In August 1942, U-boats began receiving Metox radar warning receivers. This device, officially designated FUMB-1 by the German Navy, could detect the transmissions from Allied ASV Mark II radar at ranges up to 30 miles, 3 times farther than the radar could detect the submarine. When the Metox receiver's warning light activated, the U-boat simply dived. By the time the searching aircraft arrived at the U-boat's last known position, the submarine was safely underwater and invisible. The Metox receiver transformed the tactical situation. Suddenly, U-boats had advance warning of approaching aircraft. Surface time remained relatively safe. The Germans could continue their wolf-pack tactics with confidence. Allied aircraft flying long, exhausting patrols over the Atlantic found empty ocean. U-boats they might have caught on the surface had already submerged and moved away. From August 1942 through February 1943, the effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine aircraft dropped dramatically. Coastal Command flew hundreds of sorties per month but sank very few U-boats. In December 1942, only 7 U-boats were lost to all causes, the lowest monthly total of the year. The submarines had regained the initiative. Dönitz, sensing opportunity, committed more boats to the North Atlantic. By March 1943, he had over 200 U-boats operational, with 40 to 60 at sea simultaneously in the Atlantic convoy routes. The strategic situation was becoming desperate. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, meeting at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, made defeating the U-boats their absolute top priority. Nothing else mattered if the Atlantic convoy routes could not be secured. The invasion of France, the bombing campaign against Germany, the build-up of American forces in Britain, all of it depended on keeping those sea lanes open. Every plan, every strategy, every hope for victory required solving the U-boat problem first. But the solution was not obvious. Depth charges were effective only if you could find the submarine. Destroyers were effective only if they could catch the submarine on the surface. Aircraft were effective only if the U-boat could not detect them first and dive to safety. The convoy system reduced losses but could not eliminate them. Britain was slowly being strangled by an enemy that could see the hunters coming from 30 miles away. What the Allies needed was a way to detect U-boats before the submarines detected the searching aircraft. They needed radar that operated at wavelengths the Metox receiver could not detect. They needed higher power to overcome sea clutter and extend detection range. They needed better resolution to distinguish a small submarine conning tower from waves and weather. And they needed all of this installed in aircraft that could cover the vast distances of the Atlantic, flying in all weather conditions, day and night, for hours at a time. They needed, in short, a technological revolution, and against all odds, they were about to get one. The revolution began in a university laboratory in Birmingham, England, in February 1940. 2 physicists, John Randall and Harry Boot, were working on a problem that had frustrated scientists for years. They needed to generate powerful radio waves at very short wavelengths, in the centimeter range rather than the meter range. Existing technology could not do this efficiently. Vacuum tubes that worked well at longer wavelengths lost efficiency as wavelength decreased. At 10 centimeters wavelength, conventional tubes could barely produce 10 watts of power, far too little for practical radar. Randall and Boot took a different approach. Instead of trying to improve existing tube designs, they created something entirely new. They machined a solid block of copper and drilled 6 cylindrical holes arranged in a circle around a central cavity. When electrical current passed through a cathode in the center and a powerful magnetic field surrounded the device, electrons swirled around the cavities in a precise pattern. The cavities resonated like organ pipes, but for electromagnetic radiation instead of sound. Each cavity reinforced the others, creating coherent microwave oscillation. On February 21, 1940, they tested their prototype. The device produced over 400 watts of power at a wavelength of 9.8 centimeters. This was 100 times more power than any previous system at that wavelength. The cavity magnetron, as it became known, was not an incremental improvement. It was a breakthrough that changed what was technically possible. The timing was fortunate. Britain desperately needed better radar, but lacked the industrial capacity to develop and mass-produce new technologies, while simultaneously fighting for survival against Germany. The British government made an extraordinary decision. They would share their most valuable military secret with the United States, in exchange for American industrial and scientific support. In September 1940, a British technical mission led by Sir Henry Tizard carried a cavity magnetron across the Atlantic. The demonstration took place on September 19, 1940, in the apartment of Alfred Loomis in New York. American scientists and military representatives gathered to see what the British had brought. When discussion turned to radar shortcomings, the US Navy representatives complained that their klystron tubes could only produce 10 watts at short wavelengths. With dramatic flair, physicist Edward Bowen pulled out the cavity magnetron and explained it produced 1,000 times that power. The Americans were stunned. Bell Telephone Laboratories immediately began producing copies. By the end of 1940, the radiation laboratory had been established at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically to develop radar systems using the cavity magnetron. Within months, American engineers were working on multiple applications: airborne radar for night fighters, ground mapping radar for bombers, and crucially, improved anti-submarine radar for patrol aircraft. The technical specifications of what became ASV Mark III radar, the anti-submarine version, revealed why it would be so effective. The system operated at 10 centimeters wavelength, or approximately 3,000 megahertz frequency. This was 20 times higher frequency than the ASV Mark II radar it replaced. The magnetron produced peak power of 50 to 70 kilowatts in short pulses. The antenna could be made much smaller at this wavelength, fitting easily into aircraft nose sections or wing pods. Most importantly, the higher frequency provided much better resolution, allowing operators to distinguish small targets like submarine conning towers from sea clutter. The radar display used a plan position indicator, or PPI, showing a circular map-like view with the aircraft at the center. Targets appeared as bright spots on the phosphorescent screen. A trained operator could identify a surfaced submarine at ranges up to 25 miles in good conditions, though practical detection range averaged 12 to 18 miles depending on sea state and weather. This was comparable to the old ASV Mark II in maximum range, but the crucial difference was reliability and the fact that German Metox receivers could not detect transmissions at 10 centimeters wavelength. The Metox receiver operated in the VHF to UHF range, covering wavelengths from 60 centimeters down to approximately 40 centimeters. Its lower frequency limit was about 750 MHz. The ASV Mark III radar transmitted at 3000 MHz, far above the Metox receiver's capability. The Germans would have needed an entirely different type of receiver to detect centimetric radar using different components and different detection techniques. Such a receiver did not exist in early 1943. The first ASV Mark III radar sets reached operational squadrons in March 1943. RAF Coastal Command began installing them in Wellington, Halifax, and Liberator aircraft. The impact was not immediate, because only a handful of aircraft had the new radar initially. But by April, enough aircraft were equipped to begin showing results. On April 13, 1943, Coastal Command launched Operation Derange, a concentrated offensive in the Bay of Biscay. 75 long-range aircraft, equipped with ASV Mark III, radar and plan position indicator, displays began flying intensive patrols over waters where U-boats transited between French bases and Atlantic patrol areas. The German submarine crews noticed something wrong almost immediately. Aircraft were finding them with impossible consistency, even at night, even in bad weather, even when the Metox receiver gave no warning. On April 29th, U-boat Command Headquarters received an alarming report. 5 submarines had been attacked by aircraft in a single 24-hour period. All 5 reported that their Metox receivers had given no warning. The attacks came without any prior indication. Dönitz and his technical staff struggled to understand what was happening. They considered several possibilities. Perhaps the Allies were using infrared detectors to spot heat from submarine engines. Perhaps they had developed some kind of magnetic anomaly detector. Perhaps traitors were revealing U-boat positions. The idea that a new radar operating at wavelengths their receivers could not detect was considered but seemed technically impossible based on German understanding of radar technology. Meanwhile, U-boat losses accelerated. In April 1943, 15 U-boats were sunk, a significant increase from the previous months. But May would be catastrophic. The month began with coordinated Wolfpack attacks against convoys ONS-5 and SC-128. These battles would mark the turning point of the entire Atlantic campaign. Convoy ONS-5 sailed from Britain toward North America in late April. It consisted of 43 merchant ships escorted by 16 warships, an unusually strong escort. Dönitz committed a wolf pack of 30 U-boats to destroy this convoy, the largest concentration of submarines yet assembled against a single target. The battle lasted from April 29th through May 6th and ranged over hundreds of miles as a storm scattered the convoy, and U-boats pursued individual groups of merchantmen. The escorts fought with ferocious determination. Destroyer and corvette crews hunted U-boats for days with minimal rest, using radar, sonar, Huff-Duff radio direction finding, and depth charges. Aircraft from Iceland and Newfoundland flew to the convoy's aid as it came within range of land-based air cover. These aircraft carried ASV Mark III radar. They found surfaced U-boats that were stalking the convoy, U-boats whose Metox receivers gave no warning of approaching aircraft. The final count shocked both sides. 13 merchant ships were sunk, a painful loss, but 6 U-boats were destroyed by escorts or aircraft. In the calculus of the Atlantic War, this was an unprecedented exchange rate. Previously, wolf packs expected to sink multiple ships for each submarine lost. Now they were trading nearly 1 for 1, and this made their campaign mathematically unsustainable. 2 weeks later, Convoy SC-130 was attacked by another wolf pack. Not a single merchant ship was sunk. 3 U-boats were destroyed. At least 1 U-boat was damaged. Dönitz, reading the reports at U-boat headquarters, recognized that something fundamental had changed. The advantage had shifted to the Allies. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The losses continued through May. On May 11th, U-463, a Type 14 submarine tanker, was caught on the surface by a British Halifax bomber in the Bay of Biscay. The Metox receiver gave no warning. 8 depth charges bracketed the submarine. It sank with all hands, taking with it the fuel that other U-boats needed to extend their patrols. On May 15th, another submarine tanker, U-128, was destroyed by aircraft. On May 16th, U-640 was sunk. On May 19th, U-273 went down. The losses came day after day, an unrelenting drumbeat of submarines failing to return from patrol. By mid-May 1943, U-boat crews were experiencing something they had never felt before: helplessness. These were not inexperienced sailors. Many had survived multiple patrols. They knew the dangers of destroyer attacks and depth charging. They had faced those threats and prevailed. But this was different. They were being hunted by an enemy they could not see, could not hear, and could not evade. A U-boat commander who survived this period, and was later captured, described the psychological impact in interrogation. He said that standing watch on the conning tower at night had always been dangerous but predictable. You watched for ships, for aircraft silhouettes, for any visual indication of threat. The Metox receiver gave electronic warning. Between visual watch and electronic detection, you had layers of security, but in May 1943, that security vanished. Aircraft appeared without warning, suddenly illuminated by searchlights, already dropping depth charges. There was no time to dive. Often there was barely time to realize you were under attack before the explosions began. The crew's confidence in their equipment, in their training, in their tactical doctrine, collapsed. They had been taught that careful watchkeeping and proper use of detection equipment would keep them safe. They had been told that Allied radar could be detected and that diving before the aircraft arrived would provide safety. Now none of that was true. The equipment failed. The doctrine failed. Men died without understanding what killed them. German technical staff scrambled to find answers. In March 1943, the Luftwaffe had shot down a British bomber over Rotterdam and recovered an H-2S radar set intact. This was a ground-mapping radar used by RAF Bomber Command, but it used the same 10-centimeter cavity magnetron technology as ASV Mark III. German scientists examined it and determined that it operated at wavelengths far shorter than Metox could detect. But this information took months to filter through bureaucracy and reach U-boat command. Even when commanders learned that new Allied radar existed, they had no countermeasure. Developing and producing a new receiver would take months or years. In desperation, Dönitz issued Standing War Order 483 on May 24, 1943. This order, known as the Fight Back Order, instructed U-boats to remain on the surface when attacked by aircraft and fight with anti-aircraft guns rather than diving. The logic was grimly simple. If diving no longer provided safety because aircraft could detect submarines regardless of Metox warnings, then U-boats might as well fight. Perhaps they could shoot down enough aircraft to make the exchange rate unfavorable for the Allies. The order was effectively a suicide directive. Maritime patrol aircraft were designed to attack submarines and had armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy defensive armament. U-boats had only light anti-aircraft guns, manned by crews exposed on the conning tower. In several battles, U-boats did shoot down attacking aircraft, but usually at the cost of heavy casualties to their own crews and severe damage to the submarine. The exchange rate remained catastrophic for Germany. The final statistics from May 1943 revealed the scale of the disaster. 41 U-boats were sunk, the highest monthly total of the entire war. Approximately 2,000 highly trained submarine crewmen died. These were not replaceable losses. Training a U-boat crew took months. Each submarine represented a major investment in resources and industrial capacity. Germany could not sustain such losses. On May 24, 1943, the same day he issued the Fight Back Order, Dönitz made another decision. He ordered the withdrawal of all U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. After years of mounting success, after bringing Britain to the edge of defeat, the U-boat campaign collapsed in a single month. The submarines retreated to safer areas, far from the radar-equipped aircraft that had hunted them so effectively. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over, though U-boats would continue operating in limited numbers until Germany's surrender 2 years later. The withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic in late May 1943 did not end the Battle of the Atlantic, but it fundamentally changed the equation. For the first time since 1939, merchant ships could cross the Atlantic with reasonable expectation of survival. The convoys that had fought desperately through wolf pack attacks now sailed with minimal losses. In June 1943, only 17 merchant ships were sunk in the entire North Atlantic, compared to over 100 in March. The trend continued. By autumn, monthly losses had dropped below 10 ships. This shift had immediate strategic consequences. The invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, had succeeded in November 1942, but barely. Ships and supplies had been diverted from other priorities to support the landings, leaving Britain's own supply situation dangerously thin. The Sicily invasion in July 1943 and the Italy campaign that followed required massive logistics support. None of this would have been possible if U-boats were still sinking 600,000 tons of shipping per month. The production mathematics tell the story clearly. In 1942, Allied shipyards launched 7.1 million tons of new merchant shipping. U-boats sank 7.8 million tons that year. The Allies were losing the arithmetic, but in 1943, new construction reached 14 million tons, while sinkings dropped to 3.2 million tons. The gap widened dramatically in 1944, when 20 million tons of new shipping entered service against less than 1 million tons sunk. By 1945, the U-boat force was functionally irrelevant to the war's outcome. American production capacity proved overwhelming once shipping lanes were secure. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels built in American yards, exemplified this. Industrial dominance. The first Liberty ship took 244 days to build. By 1943, the average construction time had dropped to 42 days. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was completed in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch, a publicity stunt that demonstrated what was possible with streamlined production methods. American shipyards delivered over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war. German U-boats sank approximately 200 of them, less than 8% of production. The cavity magnetron enabled this shift. ASV Mark III radar equipped not just RAF Coastal Command aircraft, but American patrol planes as well. B-24 Liberators, modified for very long-range maritime patrol, carried the radar in nose-mounted installations. These aircraft could fly from Iceland or Newfoundland to the mid-Atlantic and patrol for hours before returning, finally closing the air gap where U-boats had previously operated. Beyond land-based aircraft range, escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ship hulls or built specifically for convoy protection, brought radar-equipped aircraft directly to the convoys. The combination made operating U-boats in the North Atlantic untenable. German efforts to counter the new radar failed repeatedly. The Naxos receiver, designed to detect centimetric radar, entered service in autumn 1943, but its detection range was minimal, often only 2 to 3 miles. This gave U-boat crews seconds of warning rather than the 30 miles warning that Metox had provided against meter-wave radar. The snorkel-breathing tube, allowing submarines to run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, helped by reducing surface time but also reduced speed and operational efficiency dramatically. Type 21 submarines, advanced designs with better underwater performance, were developed but reached operational service only in the final weeks of the war. None of these countermeasures reversed the fundamental shift in advantage. The cost to Germany was devastating. Of approximately 39,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, over 28,000 died in action, a casualty rate of 72%. This made U-boat service the most dangerous assignment in any military force during the war. By comparison, RAF Bomber Command, known for horrific losses during the strategic bombing campaign, suffered approximately 44% casualties. The U-boat force lost nearly 3/4 of its personnel. The cavity magnetron's impact extended far beyond anti-submarine warfare. The same technology that enabled ASV Mark III radar made possible dozens of other applications, each contributing to Allied victory in different theaters and different campaigns. H-2S ground mapping radar used cavity magnetrons to give bombers the ability to navigate and identify targets through clouds and darkness. British night fighters used AI Mark VIII radar, another magnetron-based system, to intercept German bombers attacking British cities. American SCR-584 radar-directed anti-aircraft guns with unprecedented accuracy, helping to defeat the German Von flying bomb attacks against London in 1944. Naval fire control radar using magnetrons gave Allied warships the ability to engage enemy vessels at night and in poor visibility. This proved crucial in numerous surface actions. The Battle of the North Cape in December 1943, where the British battleship HMS Duke of York sank the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst in Arctic darkness, depended heavily on radar fire control. The first salvo, fired by Duke of York at a range of 12,000 yards, scored a hit, a feat impossible without radar. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, American ships used radar-directed gunfire to devastating effect against Japanese vessels that lacked equivalent technology. The development process itself demonstrated the value of Allied cooperation and American industrial capacity. When the Tizard mission brought the cavity magnetron to America in September 1940, British industry could barely produce a dozen units per month. Within a year, American factories were producing thousands. The radiation laboratory at MIT became a hub for radar development, eventually employing nearly 4,000 scientists and engineers. This concentration of talent produced innovations that British researchers, working in smaller teams under wartime restrictions, could not have achieved alone. Conversely, without the British invention, American radar development would have remained years behind. American engineers were working on similar concepts, but had not achieved the breakthrough that Randall and Boot accomplished. The magnetron design, shared by Britain, accelerated American radar programs by at least 2 years, possibly more. This represents one of the most successful examples of Allied military cooperation during the war. Neither nation could have achieved these results independently on the same timeline. The Germans, despite their scientific sophistication, never matched Allied radar technology. They understood the principles and captured examples of Allied radar equipment throughout the war, but they lacked the industrial capacity and the organizational focus to translate understanding into production. Germany had talented scientists and engineers, but they worked in competing bureaucracies with conflicting priorities. Resources went to multiple weapons programs, many of dubious value. The German radar development effort was fragmented across military services and industrial firms that often refused to share information. Japan faced even greater technological gaps. Japanese radar development remained primitive throughout the war. The few radar sets deployed by Japanese forces operated at long wavelengths with limited capability. Japanese night fighters operated without effective radar until the final months of the war. Japanese ships lacked the fire control radar that made American naval gunnery so deadly. The disparity contributed to catastrophic defeats in battles where Japanese forces fought bravely, but without the technological tools necessary for victory. The cavity magnetron exemplified a pattern that repeated throughout World War II. The conflict became a contest of industrial systems and scientific establishments as much as a contest of armies. Individual bravery and tactical skill mattered, but they could not overcome fundamental disadvantages in equipment, logistics, and technology. A U-boat crew could be superbly trained, experienced, and determined, but none of that mattered when radar-equipped aircraft could find them in darkness from 20 miles away. The submarine's armor provided no protection against detection. The crew's skill provided no defense against a weapon that made them visible to the enemy. This represented a new kind of warfare. Previous conflicts had seen technological change, but World War II compressed innovation into a few years of desperate development. Radar evolved from crude early warning systems in 1939 to precision fire control and navigation aids by 1945. Jet aircraft went from experimental prototypes to operational fighters. Guided missiles, developed by Germany, pointed toward future warfare that would rely increasingly on electronics and automation. The atomic bomb, of course, represented the ultimate expression of scientific warfare, but dozens of other technologies contributed to victory or defeat. The story of the cavity magnetron and ASV Mark III radar brings us back to those American naval officers in early 1941 who dismissed the experimental equipment as junk. They were not stupid or incompetent. They evaluated what they saw: a crude prototype that looked nothing like production-ready equipment. Their skepticism was reasonable, given their experience with military technology. What they failed to understand was that the device they dismissed would become one of the most important weapons of the war. This failure of imagination was understandable, but costly. Had American military leadership embraced the technology more quickly when first developed by Britain, had they prioritized its development and deployment, how many merchant ships might have been saved? How many sailors who died in the North Atlantic in 1942 might have survived if radar-equipped aircraft had closed the air gap 6 months earlier? These questions have no answers, but they remind us that judgments about emerging technology carry consequences. For the U-boat crews who faced ASV Mark III radar in May 1943, the experience shattered their understanding of naval warfare. They had been taught that submarines survived through stealth and detection avoidance. They had equipment designed to warn them of threats. They had doctrine built on years of successful operations. All of it became obsolete in a matter of weeks. The men who died in those submarines were not cowards or failures. They were professionals doing their duty with the equipment and training their nation provided. But their equipment was inadequate, their training was based on outdated assumptions, and their nation's industrial capacity could not match the Allies' ability to deploy new technology at scale. The 340 U-boats sunk by aircraft, many equipped with radar that German crews could not detect, represent more than statistics. Each boat carried 40 to 50 men. Rough arithmetic suggests approximately 15,000 sailors died in these submarines. Most were in their 20s. Many had families. All believed they were serving their country in a just cause, because that is what they had been taught. The propaganda they consumed told them Germany was fighting for survival against enemies determined to destroy their nation. They could not have known that their leaders had started the war through aggression and atrocity. They knew only that they had orders to sink Allied shipping, and they followed those orders until radar-equipped aircraft found them in the darkness and killed them. The Allies who hunted U-boats felt no guilt about this. They understood correctly, that the submarines were strangling Britain and threatening to make Allied victory impossible. Coastal Command pilots who spotted surfaced U-boats on their radar screens felt satisfaction, not remorse, when their depth charges found their targets. They had watched merchant ships burning, had seen the oil slicks and debris fields where torpedoes had struck. Many had friends who died on those merchant ships. The U-boat crews were the enemy, and destroying them was necessary work. Both perspectives were true simultaneously. The U-boat crews were serving their country and dying in hopeless battles against superior technology. The Allied aircrew were defending their nations and saving lives by killing enemy sailors. War operates in this moral complexity, where individuals on both sides act with bravery and conviction while serving causes that history judges very differently. The cavity magnetron changed warfare by making previously invisible targets visible. It shifted the advantage from the hunter to the hunted in anti-submarine operations. It demonstrated that technological superiority, combined with industrial capacity to produce weapons at scale, could overcome tactical skill and operational experience. These lessons shaped military thinking for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. Modern militaries invest enormous resources in sensors, detection systems, and information technology because World War II taught that seeing the enemy first provides overwhelming advantage. The device that American officers called junk in 1941 helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. It helped make D-Day possible by ensuring that supplies and troops could cross the Atlantic safely. It contributed to victory in a war that killed over 60 million people and reshaped the global order. The physicists who invented it, working in a university laboratory during German air raids, could not have imagined the consequences of their work. They were trying to solve a technical problem, how to generate high-power microwaves. That they succeeded changed history. When those first 50 caliber rounds punched through Japanese tank armor on Saipan, they revealed a truth about industrial warfare. Equipment matters. When radar-equipped aircraft found U-boats in Atlantic darkness, they revealed the same truth. The side with better technology, produced in greater quantities, prevails regardless of courage, training, or fighting spirit. This is not the warfare of heroic narratives and even contests. This is warfare as mathematical, calculation, where production capacity and scientific innovation determine outcomes more surely than bravery in battle. The U-boat crews who died in May 1943 discovered this truth too late to save themselves. 340 submarines never came home, destroyed by a technology their enemies had initially dismissed as junk, a weapon that saw through darkness and fog and made stealth impossible. The cost of technological inferiority, measured in lives, was absolute and unforgiving. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.